The story opens in the small, quiet town of Willow Creek, where the air smells of rain and memories. At 60 years old, Margaret Alcott stands before the old oak tree that has witnessed her entire life unfold. The tree, ancient and twisted, stands by the edge of her garden, the same place where 40 years ago, a young woman with bright eyes and a hopeful heart promised eternal love to the man she thought would never hurt her. 40 years earlier, Margaret had been just 20. She worked in a small bookstore and spent her afternoons reading poetry beneath that very oak. It was there she met Daniel, a young man with an easy smile and words that seemed dipped in honey. He was charming in a way that made her forget time. He spoke of dreams. A house filled with laughter, 2 children, and growing old together. Under that tree on a sunny afternoon, he promised her forever. And Margaret, innocent and full of belief, held onto that promise as if it were carved into her soul. Life, for many years, seemed to fulfill that dream. They built a little white house together, its porch wrapped in vines, and the smell of coffee always in the air. Margaret loved mornings, the clinking of Daniel's teacup, the way he would hum softly as he read the newspaper. Every day felt safe, predictable, full of love. Their children grew up, their careers stabilized, and their love appeared to have endured the storms of time. But love, Margaret later realized, it doesn't always die loudly. Sometimes it fades quietly, like a candle burning out in an empty room. As she turned 60, a strange stillness began to settle between them. Daniel had grown more distant, often lost in thought, his smile thinner, his words shorter. When she asked him what was wrong, he would simply say, "I'm just tired." Margaret tried to fill the silence, with laughter, with dinners, with questions. But the air between them only grew colder. He started spending long evenings away, explaining that work had become demanding again. Even though he was nearing retirement, she wanted to believe him because belief was easier than truth. After 40 years, how could she imagine her world without trust? On the night of her 60th birthday, Daniel seemed distracted. Their children had called earlier, and she had baked her favorite cake, a simple vanilla sponge, the same one she made every year. Daniel smiled, wished her, even kissed her forehead, but his eyes were far away, lost in another world. When she blew out the candles, she made a wish, not for youth, not for wealth, but for their love to feel alive again. Later that night, as the clock ticked toward midnight, she walked out to the oak tree. The moonlight wrapped the branches in silver, and she placed her hand on the rough bark. It had grown thicker over the decades, its roots deeper. So had her love, or so she thought. She remembered that first promise Daniel made. No matter what happens, you and I, always. The memory warmed her heart, yet a quiet unease lingered. Why did his voice echo in her mind with a hint of distance? Days passed, and the silence between them stretched like a thin thread ready to break. She began to notice little things. The way Daniel avoided her gaze, how he hid his phone when messages arrived, how his laughter came easily when he thought she wasn't around. Each moment planted a seed of doubt, but Margaret brushed it away, convincing herself that she was imagining things. After all, 40 years of love couldn't crumble so easily. Could it still? Her heart knew what her mind refused to accept. Love, she thought, is not blind. It just refuses to see until it's forced to. One evening, while cleaning Daniel's study, she found an old photo album on his desk. It was closed, but a single photograph slipped out, a picture of Daniel smiling at someone she didn't recognize. A woman, younger, radiant, and laughing. The sight made her chest tighten. She tried to dismiss it, telling herself it must have been from a work event. But deep inside, a quiet voice whispered, "This is where forever begins to end." Margaret placed the photo back and closed the drawer. That night, she couldn't sleep. The bed felt cold beside her. Daniel's breathing, once a comfort, now sounded distant and unfamiliar. She turned to look at him and realized, for the first time, she didn't know the man lying next to her. As dawn broke, she went outside once more to the oak tree. The morning light painted the leaves gold, and the world seemed so still that even time paused. She whispered softly, "We promised to grow old together." Her voice trembled, but the tree offered no answer. Only the wind replied, carrying her words into the distance. In that silence, she felt the first crack in her heart, small but deep. The promise beneath the old tree had once been her foundation. Now, it stood as a quiet witness to something breaking. Margaret didn't know it yet, but that old tree would soon become the only place where she could speak her truth, where love, betrayal, and silence would all meet beneath its shadow. This was the beginning of the end, the first thread of a 40-year tapestry slowly unraveling, and as the chapter closes, Margaret turns away from the oak tree, unaware that the roots of her sorrow had already begun to grow. Morning sunlight filtered through the lace curtains, spilling across Margaret's living room. It was an ordinary day, or at least it began that way. She had planned to dust Daniel's study, a small corner of the house filled with the scent of ink paper and his cologne. After 40 years of sharing space, she knew every drawer, every book, every old receipt he refused to throw away. But that morning, her hands trembled slightly as she opened his desk drawer, as if her heart already knew it was about to meet something it wasn't ready for. Beneath a stack of unpaid bills and bank statements, she found a single envelope, cream-colored, sealed, and marked with a date from a few months earlier. It wasn't addressed to her. The name written in Daniel's handwriting read Elaine. The letters curved softly, the way he used to write her name on birthday cards. Lovingly, almost like a caress, Margaret's throat tightened. Her fingers hovered over the seal for a long time before she finally tore it open. Inside, the words bled like wounds. My dearest Elaine. Every day with her feels like a lie. I'm trapped in a life I no longer recognize. You are the only truth left to me. I don't know how much longer I can keep pretending. The rest of the letter blurred before her eyes as tears welled up. The penmanship was unmistakable, Daniel's. The tone was tender, desperate, full of longing for another woman. Margaret dropped the letter as if it had burned her. Her hands flew to her mouth to keep in the sound that wanted to escape. A cry too heavy for words. For a few seconds, the world around her seemed to collapse. The ticking clock grew louder, the air thicker. Her mind screamed, no, this can't be real. But the letter on the floor said otherwise. For 40 years, she had believed in Daniel, the man who promised forever, the man who held her when their son was born, the man who brought her roses on their anniversary. And now, she was holding proof that forever was a lie written on paper. She sank into his chair, clutching the letter again, forcing herself to read it once more, every word a dagger cutting deeper. Daniel had written of their secret meetings, of promises he couldn't keep, of guilt that tormented him but never enough to make him stop. He wrote that Elaine made him feel alive again, that she was his escape from a life that had lost its spark. Margaret felt as though she had been erased, replaced by someone else's laughter, someone else's embrace. It wasn't just betrayal, it was erasure of identity. The woman she had been, wife, mother, partner, now felt like a ghost haunting her own house. For hours she sat there in silence. She didn't cry, not yet. The pain was too vast for tears. Instead, she felt a strange numbness crawl over her, the kind that comes when heartbreak is too deep to name. She thought of confronting him immediately, but something stopped her. Perhaps fear, perhaps disbelief. She needed to understand how long this had been happening, how much of her life had been built on lies. Margaret began searching through his things with trembling urgency, not out of anger, but of desperation. She needed proof that she hadn't imagined the love they once shared. But every drawer she opened only deepened the wound, hidden notes, perfume-stained letters, a hotel receipt, pieces of a secret life carefully tucked away in the same home where she cooked his meals and waited for his return every night. At one point, she found a small box filled with keepsakes, a gold bracelet, a locket, and a photograph of Daniel smiling beside Elaine. He looked younger, happier, freer. Margaret's reflection in the frame blurred through tears as she whispered, "Was I ever enough?" The silence that followed was louder than any answer. Evening descended quietly. When Daniel came home, she sat at the dining table, dinner untouched, her face pale and her eyes hollow. He kissed her forehead absent-mindedly and asked about her day. She wanted to scream, to throw the letter at him, to make him feel the agony clawing through her chest, but she didn't. Instead, she simply said, "It was quiet." Her voice didn't tremble. Her hands didn't shake. Inside, however, her world had stopped turning. That night, as Daniel slept peacefully beside her, Margaret lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Her mind replayed their memories, the laughter, the anniversaries, the years spent believing in something sacred. Each memory now felt poisoned, tainted by deceit. The bed felt foreign, the walls unfamiliar. Her life had become a stranger's story. By morning, she decided not to confront him. Not yet. She folded the letter carefully, placed it back into its envelope, and hid it beneath her clothes in the wardrobe. She needed time to think, to breathe, to decide what came next. Confrontation would come, but not in anger. She wanted him to feel what she felt. Silence so heavy it suffocated, truth so sharp it bled. In the days that followed, she observed Daniel quietly. His routine, his excuses, his forced smiles. Every lie he told her was now crystal clear. He spoke of work trips and late meetings, of clients and deadlines. But she no longer believed a word. She had learned to see between the lines, to listen to what was not being said. Each time he lied, she smiled faintly, because she knew. And he didn't know that she knew. Her pain turned into something colder, deeper. A kind of stillness that bordered on rage. But this rage did not scream. It simmered, slow and patient, waiting for its moment. Margaret often found herself standing under the oak tree again, staring at the sky. It was there that she whispered the question that haunted her most. If he could love someone else, did he ever really love me? The wind rustled through the branches but offered no answer. By the end of this chapter, the woman who once believed in eternal love was gone. In her place stood someone quiet, wounded, and dangerous in her calm. The letter had changed everything, not just her view of Daniel, but of herself. She had spent 40 years being the woman he loved. Now, she would learn how to be the woman who no longer needed him. The letter that never reached her wasn't meant to be found. But fate, in its cruel mercy, had delivered it. And with that discovery, Margaret's silence began, the kind of silence that comes before a storm. The morning Daniel died was strangely peaceful. The sky hung low with soft gray clouds, and a gentle drizzle touched the windows. Margaret remembered thinking it felt like the world itself was sighing. She had woken early, as always, made coffee, and waited for Daniel to come down the stairs. But instead of hearing his footsteps, she heard a sound she couldn't quite place. A dull thud, like something heavy falling. When she rushed upstairs, the sight froze her heart. Daniel lay on the floor near the bed, one hand clutching his chest, the other stretched toward the nightstand. His eyes were open but empty. For a moment, she just stood there, staring, unable to breathe. The man who had once been her entire life now lay lifeless, his lips slightly parted as if trying to speak one last word. She called for help, her voice breaking, but deep inside she already knew it was too late. The paramedics confirmed what her heart had whispered the moment she saw him. Daniel was gone. When they carried his body away, Margaret stood in the hallway, clutching the wall for support. The silence that followed was suffocating. A silence not of peace, but of unfinished words, unanswered questions, and buried truths. She thought she would cry, scream, collapse, but no tears came. Instead, she felt a strange calm, almost as if her body refused to grieve for a man who had betrayed her love. The house felt heavier in the days that followed. Family and friends filled it with condolences and flowers. Everyone spoke of Daniel as a good husband, a loyal friend, a man of integrity. They said he was hardworking, loving, devoted. Margaret smiled, politely thanked them, nodded in all the right places. But inside, she was screaming. If only you knew the truth, she wanted to say. If only you knew who he really was. Every condolence sounded like a lie. Every kind word for Daniel felt like salt pressed into her wounds. Even her children spoke of their father with reverence, unaware of the letters, the secrets, the years of deceit. Margaret watched them and said nothing. She couldn't bring herself to destroy their image of him. Not yet. The funeral was held 3 days later. The church smelled of lilies and rain, and Daniel's coffin rested beneath a stained glass window that bathed the room in color. Margaret sat in the front row, dressed in black, her face unreadable. People whispered about how composed she seemed, how strong she must be, but they didn't understand that strength had nothing to do with it. Her heart was simply empty. When the priest asked everyone to bow their heads for a minute of silence, the world seemed to hold its breath. 1 minute, 660 seconds, for a man she had loved for 40 years. As everyone around her prayed, Margaret stared at the coffin and thought, 40 years of love and now 1 minute of silence. That was all that remained. But inside that silence, she made a vow, one no one heard. She didn't promise forgiveness. She didn't pray for his soul. She whispered, so softly only she could hear, "You lied to me in life. In death, I'll tell the truth for you." It wasn't a vow of vengeance born of hate. It was something colder, quieter, and far more dangerous. She would not let him rest in a lie. She would make sure the truth he hid so carefully would come to light. After the funeral, the house felt emptier than ever. The same oak tree that had once sheltered their love now stood like a witness to her loneliness. She walked to it that evening, the wind tugging at her hair, and spoke aloud, "You're gone, Daniel, but your secrets aren't." The branches swayed as if listening. Over the next few days, Margaret began sorting through his belongings. People told her to take her time, to rest, to grieve, but grief was not what she felt. She moved through the house like a ghost, opening drawers, reading papers, collecting fragments of the life he had hidden from her. Bank statements, messages, letters, all proof of the man behind the mask. Each discovery didn't break her anymore. It only solidified her resolve. The truth, she thought, shouldn't die with him, but something else stirred within her too. Confusion. Despite everything, she couldn't erase 40 years of memories overnight. She would look at his old sweater hanging by the door and feel a pang of something close to sorrows. She would remember how he laughed when they danced in the kitchen, how he held her hand through her father's funeral, how he told her she was his home. Those moments had felt real. Were they lies too? Or had he loved her once before someone else took her place? It was this conflict, love and betrayal, grief and anger, that began to shape the woman she was becoming, a woman who had spent a lifetime in the shadow of someone else's choices. Now, with Daniel gone, she was finally free to see the truth, not just about him, but about herself. One night, as she sat alone by the window, she took the letter, that letter, and placed it on the table beside his framed photograph. His smiling face stared back at her, frozen in time. "You don't get to rest in peace," she said quietly. "Not yet." She struck a match and set the letter ablaze, watching the fire consume the paper until it turned to ash. It wasn't forgiveness. It was cleansing. By the end of this chapter, Margaret is no longer the fragile woman who trembled with heartbreak. The silence that began at Daniel's funeral is no longer empty. It's alive with purpose. Her tears have dried, her voice has hardened, and her mind is clear. She understands now that her revenge doesn't need to be loud or cruel. It will be measured, precise, and built from truth. As she stands before the oak tree once more, she whispers to the wind, "You broke your promise, Daniel, but I'll keep mine, even if it's the last thing I do." And with that, she walks back into the house, leaving behind the echo of a love that ended not with a scream, but with a silence sharper than any blade. Weeks had passed since Daniel's funeral, but Margaret's world still felt suspended between grief and revelation. The house was too quiet now. No footsteps, no murmured conversations, no clinking of cups during breakfast, only silence. But within that silence, something was awakening, not sorrow, not despair, but determination. For the first time in 40 years, Margaret had control over her life, and she intended to use it. It began innocently enough, sorting through Daniel's possessions. She told her children she was organizing things for closure, but in truth, she was searching for the rest of his secrets. The letter to Elaine had been just one piece of a larger puzzle, and she needed to know everything. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about understanding the man she had shared a lifetime with, and the woman she had been because of him. One afternoon, she opened the old wooden chest Daniel had kept locked for years. The key had always been in his drawer, but she'd never dared to use it before. Her hands trembled slightly as she turned it, hearing the click of release. Inside lay a world she had never known: photographs, receipts from hotels in cities he'd never mentioned visiting, and a diary, not his daily journal. This was different, personal, emotional. When she began to read, her heart constricted. Page after page revealed his thoughts, his fears, and his guilt. He wrote of Elaine, of how she made him feel alive again, of how he couldn't bear to leave Margaret because she was too kind, too loyal, too undeserving of pain. He called himself a coward, admitting he didn't have the courage to choose truth over comfort. Every word painted a picture not just of betrayal, but of weakness. Daniel hadn't just deceived her, he had pitied her. So that realization cut deeper than any affair. Margaret's eyes lingered on one entry dated a month before his death. Elaine wants me to leave. I can't. Margaret doesn't deserve that, but living this double life is killing me. Maybe it's better if it ends this way. Quietly. The words chilled her. Maybe it's better if it ends this way. Had he known, had guilt been his undoing? She wasn't sure, but for the first time, she didn't care. Death had saved him from the consequences he refused to face in life. But now she would face them for him. The next day, while donating some of Daniel's clothes, she encountered Elaine in person. She hadn't expected it. Elaine arrived at her door unannounced, holding a small bouquet of lilies, her face painted with concern. "I wanted to pay my respects," she said softly, her tone polished, practiced. "Daniel meant so much to me, to all of us." For a moment, Margaret just looked at her, the woman who had unknowingly rewritten her life. Elaine was younger, graceful, with eyes that still carried the glow of love. Yet behind that glow, Margaret sensed guilt, or perhaps fear. She invited her in, her voice calm and polite, masking the storm beneath her skin. They sat at the dining table, two women bound by one man's lies. Margaret poured tea with steady hands, her eyes never leaving Elaine's face. Every detail fascinated her. The way Elaine's fingers trembled slightly when she reached for her cup, the way she avoided eye contact when Daniel's name was mentioned. Margaret said little. Her silence was deliberate, sharp as glass. And in that silence, Elaine began to unravel. I didn't mean for any of this." Elaine stammered after a while. "He told me you were unhappy, that you'd grown apart. I thought." Margaret interrupted gently. "You thought you were saving him." Elaine looked down, ashamed. "I thought I was giving him what he needed." Margaret smiled faintly. "And what did he give you?" Elaine hesitated. "Hope." The word echoed painfully through the room. Hope. The same thing Margaret had clung to for 40 years. The same illusion Daniel had fed them both. By the end of the tea, Elaine looked as though she'd aged a decade. Margaret hadn't raised her voice once, hadn't uttered a single cruel word. She didn't need to. Her calmness was more punishing than anger could ever be. When Elaine left, Margaret watched her walk down the path and thought, that's how the truth begins to work, quietly, slowly, until it consumes everything. Over the following weeks, Margaret began telling people small truths, not accusations, not drama, just facts. When neighbors spoke fondly of Daniel, she would mention his work trips that weren't for work. When his colleagues praised his loyalty, she would smile and say, yes, he was loyal in his own way. Her words spread like whispers, each one planting seeds of doubt. The perfect image Daniel had built over 4 decades began to crumble. She wasn't cruel about it. She didn't lie. She simply stopped protecting him. That, she realized, was her revenge to let the truth live, to strip away the mask he'd worn so carefully. But even as she revealed Daniel's secrets, she discovered something within herself, strength she didn't know she possessed. For years, she had been quiet because she believed silence meant peace. Now she understood that sometimes silence is the loudest form of justice. Late one night, Margaret returned to the oak tree. The wind carried the scent of rain, and the moonlight bathed everything in silver. She brought the diary with her. Opening to the final page, she read Daniel's last words again, then whispered, "You thought silence would save you, but it's mine now." She set the diary down at the base of the tree, letting the wind turn its pages. Then she walked away, not looking back. The chapter closes with Margaret standing at her window, watching the dawn. The truth, once buried beneath decades of lies, now lived in the open. Daniel's reputation was fading, but Margaret's spirit was awakening. The silence after his death had not broken her. It had rebuilt her. She was no longer just the widow of Daniel Alcott. She was the keeper of his truth, the witness to his downfall, and the author of her own freedom. The unfolding of his secrets had become the rewriting of her story. Months had passed since Daniel's death. The seasons had begun to change, spring melting into summer. Yet for Margaret, time felt both still and endless. The house that had once echoed with the sound of his footsteps now belonged entirely to her. No more waiting for the door to open. No more pretending to sleep beside someone she no longer trusted. For the first time in 40 years, Margaret's life was hers alone. But peace, she had learned, doesn't come easily. It has to be earned, often through pain, truth, and silence. In the weeks following her quiet revelations, the whispers had spread through the town like wind through dry leaves. People no longer spoke of Daniel with the same blind admiration. The stories that had once painted him as a devoted husband and a man of honor began to fade, replaced by uncertain glances and hushed conversations. Margaret didn't need to say much. The truth had done its own work. Yet even as she watched the illusion of her husband crumble, Margaret didn't feel triumph. There was no victory in exposing the truth, only a quiet ache. She hadn't done it to destroy him. She had done it to free herself from the prison of his lies. Revenge, she realized, wasn't about making someone else suffer. It was about reclaiming what their deceit had stolen. Dignity, peace, and the right to breathe without shame. One afternoon, as sunlight streamed through the curtains, Margaret packed the last of Daniel's belongings into a box. She wasn't crying nor smiling, just breathing steadily, like someone exhaling years of sorrow. The last item she held was a framed photo. Their wedding day, Daniel in his suit, young and confident, and she in her lace gown, eyes shining with love. It was painful to look at, but she didn't tear it apart. Instead, she placed it gently in the box, whispering, "I loved you once." That's enough. After sealing the box, she called a charity to come collect his things. As the truck pulled away, she stood on the porch, watching the dust rise from the driveway. That box carried not just his clothes, but the weight of her past. And with it gone, the air around her felt lighter. That night, for the first time, Margaret slept peacefully. No dreams, no haunting memories, no tears soaking her pillow, just stillness. The kind of stillness that feels earned. In the days that followed, she started rebuilding her life, quietly, simply. She began volunteering at the town library again, spending her mornings surrounded by books and the comforting scent of paper and ink. She took long walks through Willow Creek, noticing things she'd long ignored. The way the sunlight danced on the water, the laughter of children, the smell of fresh bread from the bakery. Life, it seemed, had been waiting for her all along, waiting for her to notice it. But Margaret's heart still carried one final task, one final chapter to close. She knew she couldn't move forward until she said goodbye, properly this time, not to the man he became, but to the love that had once been real. So one golden afternoon, she walked to the old oak tree, the place where it had all begun, the same tree beneath which a 20-year-old girl had fallen in love, and a 60-year-old woman had learned the truth of that love. The wind rustled through its branches, whispering softly as if welcoming her back. She sat beneath it, the bark rough against her palm, and spoke aloud. "You took 40 years of my life," she said, her voice steady, "but you gave me one lesson, that silence can be strength." Her eyes lifted to the branches. "I don't hate you, Daniel. I did for a while, but not anymore. You don't deserve my hate. You don't deserve anything more from me at all." A tear rolled down her cheek, not of pain, but of release. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small envelope. Inside was a letter she had written weeks ago, her final words to him. She unfolded it and read it one last time. "Daniel, you once said love means never keeping secrets. You broke that promise, but I won't. The truth is, I loved you, completely, foolishly, honestly. And now I let you go. Wherever you are, may you finally know peace. Because now I do." She folded the letter, placed it at the base of the tree, and smiled faintly. The wind caught the edge of the paper and carried it away, fluttering like a white bird into the distance. Watching it disappear, Margaret felt something inside her settle, the kind of calm that comes only after storms. That evening, she returned home to the quiet hum of the world outside. She brewed tea, sat by the window, and listened to the soft rustle of leaves. There was no loneliness now, only solitude. And in that solitude, peace. For the first time in her life, Margaret didn't feel defined by anyone else. She wasn't Daniel's wife, or the victim of betrayal, or the widow with a sad story. She was simply Margaret, whole, strong, and free. As night fell, she lit a candle on the windowsill. It's not for mourning, but for remembrance. The flame flickered gently, casting a warm glow across the room. She whispered, 40 years of love, 1 minute of silence, and now a lifetime of peace. The house, once filled with ghosts of memory, now felt alive with her presence. Every creak, every breath of wind through the curtains belonged to her. She had taken back her voice, her truth, her life. And under the same sky where Daniel once made his promise, Margaret closed her eyes, finally at rest within herself. The story that began with love and betrayal ended not in vengeance, but in peace. The kind that doesn't come from forgetting, but from finally forgiving the past enough to move beyond it. For Margaret Alcott, silence was no longer a punishment. It was freedom. It was 1 minute of peace. That would last forever.